As I said this morning, this teach-in is just a small part of what we are doing at the University of Oklahoma to show our commitment to the teaching of our students about our founding and our Constitution, our form of government, our roots as a people, which is so crucial to their citizenship in the future. To promote better understanding, we about 2 years ago, is that right, Kyle, formed the Institute for America's Constitutional Heritage. We have an incredible group of scholars who are associated with the Institute. And I wonder if Kyle, if the others that are core faculty members and associate members who are teaching courses through our Institute would all please stand. Let's recognize the faculty members from our Institute of Constitutional Heritage. Today, the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, who is widely regarded by his peers as a leader in the academic field of the teaching of American history of this period, and we were privileged to have him visit us once before, and it's a great privilege to have him back again. He's going to be introduced today to you by Professor Paul Gillia, and he is a George Lynn Cross Research Professor of U.S. History and the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation Presidential Professor, and appropriate again as we're in this Samuel Roberts Noble Museum. His work focuses on the American Revolution and our early republic. His many publications include Liberty on the Waterfront, American Maritime Society and Culture in the Age of Revolution, 1750 to 1850, which has won 2 national prizes, including the Best Book Award from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. In 2009 and 2010, he served as national president of that society. He is an award-winning teacher who offers a wide variety of courses at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. He earned his doctorate degree from Brown University, and Professor Gordon Wood was his dissertation advisor, his mentor in the course of his graduate work. And so we felt it only appropriate to have one of Gordon Wood's students, a distinguished member of our own faculty, come and introduce him today. Professor Gillia.
Thank you, President Bourne, for that very nice introduction. And thank you for this opportunity to introduce a person who's very important in my life, in my career. I am very pleased to welcome Gordon Wood, who, as President Bourne said, is no stranger to our university. We were fortunate enough to hear him speak here just about a year ago today. And obviously, he's no stranger to me. He took me on as a graduate student in the 1970s at Brown University. Wood is author of many works, perhaps best known to many of you as the author of The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He's also published a huge volume on the early republic called Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, which is also a phenomenal piece of work. Perhaps among historians, Wood is most noted for his creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, which garnered the Bancroft Prize and the John Dunning Prize. For the last 31 years, since I started teaching here at the University of Oklahoma, students in my classes have worked their way through this 613-page book on my courses on the American Revolution, and now, of course, on the American Constitution. And I consider this book perhaps the single most important work on the Constitution published in the last 100 years. And that date, I chose that date purposely. I consider perhaps two books maybe more important, maybe not. One is by some guys back in the 18th century, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. the Federalist Papers, and the other, maybe Charles Beard's Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. Wood's book is better, I think, than Beard's, because Beard was a little wrong, and Gordon, you were all right. I'm going to mention one other book that Wood has written, published recently, that I would encourage all of you to go out and buy and read. It is his Purposes of the Past, which is a collection of his essays, which are published in the New York Review of Books and the New Republic. In lucid prose, Wood not only probes the books under review, but he also outlines what I cherish most from my graduate education. That is his incredibly deep insight into how to think about history. I read this book every once in a while, I underline these certain passages, say, yes, yes, that's exactly the way people ought to be thinking about history. He taught for over 4 decades at Brown, where he is currently the Alva Oway University Professor of History Emeritus. And I was his graduate student, graduate assistant for a number of years. Almost every year, there'd be 200 students just packed, undergraduates packed into his lecture courses. And I'd just look in their faces, and they were just absolutely awestruck by the intellectual firepower of his lectures. As a teacher, as a scholar, no one has explained better than Gordon Wood the factors that came together to produce the unique generation that led to the American Revolution and that created the American Constitution. Please join me in welcoming my mentor and my friend, Gordon Wood.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that generous introduction. I wish all my students were as talented as Paul was and is. Well, Jefferson would be enthralled to be here in this wonderful museum. He was fascinated by the idea of a mastodon, which is what he called it, a mammoth. And he would love to see these dinosaurs next door. Of course, he did not believe that any species went extinct. So he assumed that mammoths in his own lifetime were roaming the lands out west somewhere, maybe Oklahoma, maybe where Missouri, Colorado, so on. He assumed that these creatures were still there because God would not allow a species to go extinct. And so, in some sense, we haven't even today allowed them to go extinct because we have these kinds of museums. Now, I want to talk about these founders, what they mean to us, and why we honor them the way we do. They have a special significance, I think, for us Americans. Celebrating in the way we do this generation that fought the revolution and created the Constitution is peculiar to us as a people. No other major nation, as far as I know, honors its past historical characters in quite the way we do. We want to know what Thomas Jefferson would make of affirmative action. What would George Washington? These are questions that people ask me at the end of a lecture. What would George Washington think of the invasion of Iraq? The British, as far as I know, don't have to check in periodically with, say, either of the 2 William Pitts to find out how David Cameron's government's doing. This kind of connection, we have a special need for these authentic historical figures in the here and now. Why should this be so? Now, scholars, I think, have a variety of answers. Some suggest that our continual concern with constitutional jurisprudence and original intent accounts for our fascination with the founding and the making of the Constitution. Still others think that these historical figures are important as a kind of gold standard of what political leadership ought to be. And so we bring them back to kind of draw contrasts with our contemporary figures. Why don't we have such great figures now seems to be the implicit question that people ask. But I think the most important reason for our preoccupation with this revolutionary generation has to do with our sense of identity as Americans, as the kind of people we are. The identities of other nations, say being French or being German, are lost in the midst of time and are usually taken for granted, which is why I think such nations are having such problems with immigration. Now, I know we think we have a problem with immigration, but it pales into insignificance compared to the problems the Europeans are facing and will continue to face over the coming century with this invasion from the South. But Americans became a nation in 1776, and thus it is, in order to know who we are, we need to know who the founders are. The United States was founded on a set of beliefs and not, as were other nations, on a common ethnicity or common language or religion. Not only did our revolution in 1776 legally create the United States, but I think it infused into our culture nearly everything we believe in, our highest aspirations, our noblest ideals, equality, liberty, constitutionalism, the well-being of ordinary people. All of this came out of this revolution. So it's these ideas, these aspirations that hold us together and make us a single people. You know, McDonald's and Starbucks can't do it. We need something else. And we're not a nation in the usual sense of the term. There's no common ethnicity. The whole world is in America. So what else have we got to make us a single people but these ideals, these aspirations? So as long as the republic endures, in other words, I think we Americans are destined to look back at this founding. Now, Abraham Lincoln knew this. He identified completely with the founders and thought all Americans should do so too. Present-day academics have sometimes mocked the close feelings that ordinary people have with these founders, but it's not so easy to mock Lincoln. The American people of 1858, said Lincoln, deeply felt the moral principle of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And Peter mentioned this morning. And this moral principle made them one with the founders. In Lincoln's words, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, he said, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriots and liberty-loving men together, that will link these patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. Now, despite what Tom Brokaw says, I think these founders represent the greatest generation. They were larger than life, giants in the earth, a forest of giant oaks, Lincoln called them. They seem to possess intellectual and political capacities well beyond the generations that followed them. We Americans have been unable to look back at them without being overawed by the brilliance of their thought, the creativity of their politics, and the sheer magnitude of their achievement. So what were they like? What made them different from succeeding generations and from us? Now, great as they were, the revolutionary leaders were certainly not demigods and not superhuman. They were very much the product of peculiar circumstances and a peculiar moment in time, which is the thrust of my talk. Nor were they immune to the allures of interest that attracted most ordinary human beings. They wanted wealth and position and often speculated heavily in order to realize those aims. They were not demigods, but they were not Democrats either. And that was mentioned this morning, quite rightly. Certainly not Democrats in any modern sense of the term. They were never embarrassed by talk of elitism, and they never hid their sense of superiority to ordinary folk. But neither were they contemptuous of ordinary people. In fact, they always believed that the people in general were the source of their authority. And so I think we had a moment there where we had a nice balance between what you might call democratic and aristocratic values. But even in their own undemocratic time and circumstances, they were unusual, if not unique. As political leaders, they comprised a peculiar sort of elite, a self-created aristocracy largely based on merit and talent that was unlike the hereditary aristocracy, the nobility that ruled 18th century English society. Now, 18th century Britain remained under the authority of about 400 families, whose fabulous scale of landed wealth, political influence, and aristocratic grandeur was unmatched by anyone or anything in North America. The Duke of Rockingham's country house in Northumberland was 650 feet long, longer than 2 football fields. Now compare that to Westover, William Byrd's house in Virginia on the James River, which is about 90 feet long, and you begin to get a sense of the scale of things. And any of you who have seen these country houses in England know there's just nothing like that in America. While Charles Carroll of Maryland, one of the wealthiest planners in the American South, was earning what Americans regarded as the huge sum of 1,800 pounds a year, the Earl of Derby's vast estates were bringing in an annual income of over 40,000 pounds. By English standards, American aristocrats like Washington and Jefferson, even with their hundreds of slaves, remained minor gentry at best. And by the English measure of status, lawyers like John Adams or Alexander Hamilton were even less distinguished. Gentlemen, no doubt, but nothing like the English nobility. The American revolutionary elite was thus very different from the English aristocracy. By its very difference, however, it was ideally suited to exploit the peculiar character of the 18th century Enlightenment. Now, the 18th century Anglo-American Enlightenment was preoccupied with what they called politeness, which had a much broader meaning for them than it does for us today. It implied more than manners or decorum. It meant affability, sociability, cultivation. Indeed, politeness was considered to be the source of civility, which was a word that was soon superseded by the word civilization. Civilization implied a social process. You became civilized. Societies, it was assumed, moved through successive stages of historical development. There was the common 4-stage theory at the end of the 18th century, from the hunter-gatherers to shepherding to farming to the final stage of commercial development. Beginning in the rude simplicity and progressing, so to speak, to refined complexity of civilization. And all nations could be located along this spectrum of social development. Since civilization was something that could be achieved, everything was enlisted in order to push back barbarism, push back ignorance, and spread civility and refinement. All sorts of new organizations and instruments sprung up to spread light and knowledge among people. This is what we mean by the Enlightenment. Learned societies, lending libraries, debating clubs, assembly rooms, reading groups, gentlemanly magazines, concerts, galleries, museums. 18th century English speakers saw the beginning of culture as a public commodity, as something that was valuable, that gave status, and thus could be acquired. In other words, the cultural world that we're familiar with today was born in this age of enlightenment. At the center of this new civilized world was the idea of a gentleman. Now, defining a proper gentleman was a subject that fascinated the educated public of the 18th century English-speaking world. And writers from Richard Steele, Addison and Steele, the Roger de Coverley papers, to Jane Austen, spent their lives struggling with what constituted the proper character of a gentleman. Indeed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were still going at it in their retirement years, in their correspondence. For many in the 18th century, including the American revolutionaries, being a gentleman assumed a moral meaning that was more important than its social significance. Pure monarchists might still define aristocratic exclusivity by the pride of their families, the size of their estates, the lavishness of their display, and the arrogance of their bearing. But others now increasingly downplayed or ridiculed these characteristics. Think of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Everybody knows that story. Elizabeth Bennet is looking for the perfect gentleman, and she does not want him to just have 10,000 pounds a year. She doesn't care whether his bloodline through Lady Burr is important. She wants character, she wants talent, she wants taste, she wants all of this politeness in the man she's going to marry. In fact, I think all of her novels, think of Emma, Mr. Knightley is also her idea of a perfect gentleman. They're all concerned with these new characteristics of distinction. They emphasized new man-made criteria of gentility, politeness, grace, taste, learning, character. Those are the things that Jane Austen was fascinated by. Even to the point, I think, these were emphasized so much that even someone who was a lord, a peer of the realm like Lord Chesterfield, liked to think that his exalted social position was based on his talent and merit and not on something that he had inherited. To be a gentleman was to think and act like a gentleman, nothing more. It meant being reasonable, tolerant, honest, and virtuous. Being a gentleman was the prerequisite to becoming a political leader. It signified being cosmopolitan, standing on an elevated ground in order to have a large view of human affairs, and being free of the prejudices, the parochialism, and the religious enthusiasm of the vulgar and the barbaric. It meant, in short, having all those characteristics that we today sum up in the ideal or the idea of a liberal arts education. Indeed, the 18th century created the modern idea of a liberal arts education in the English-speaking world. The age-old distinction between gentlemen and commoners had a vital meaning for this generation that we today have totally lost. I mean, we put the title gentleman on our restroom doors. It marked a horizontal cleavage that divided the social hierarchy into two unequal parts almost as sharply as the distinction between officers and soldiers divided the army. And in fact, today we talk about officer and gentleman. The two were linked. Gentlemen, who constituted about 5 to 10% of the society, 5% in the South, 10% perhaps in New England, were all those at the top of the social hierarchy who were wealthy enough to not have to work, or at least not have to work with their hands. They were those who seemed to able to act in a disinterested manner in promoting the public good. Disinterestedness is a special term that they used over and over again, especially Washington. They used it as a synonym for the classical conception of virtue or self-sacrifice. It meant being impartial. We today have lost almost all of that meaning. Educated people today use the term disinterested as a synonym for uninterested. In fact, you'll find those two meanings in your dictionary. But in the 18th century, it had a distinctive meaning. It didn't mean uninterested or not caring. It meant being impartial, being able to rise above an emotional or pecuniary interest and make a decision that didn't further your own interests. That's a kind of characteristic that we seem to have lost because the word, it's almost as if we can't believe that anyone is truly disinterested, and therefore the word has become equated with uninterested, not caring, indifferent. I think perhaps there are only two occupations left in the country that we presume a certain amount of disinterestedness. Can you think of what they might be? Two occupations? Judges? I think judges are one of those groups that we consider to be disinterested, although they're coming into doubt because of the controversial hearings over their appointments. We even have beginning to doubt the disinterestedness of judges. But there is one other occupation that is so fundamental to our whole way of life that we count on these people being disinterested. Can you think what that might be? No, not the clergy. No, you think it's referees and umpires in our sporting events. Think about it. I mean, the kid grows up in Boston as a Red Sox fan, and he becomes an umpire in the American League, and he's umpiring a Yankees-Red Sox game. We expect him to be disinterested, meaning he's going to rise above the emotional commitment that he had to the Red Sox and make disinterested judgments. This is what they meant. Impartiality, rising above a pecuniary interest in particular, or else any an emotional interest. Now, not everybody bought into this. John Adams, cantankerous as he was very jealous in the 1780s of George Washington, who liked to to act out the part of being the disinterested man. And of course, that's why he refused a salary as commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. And Adams reaches a point in 1785 where he has had enough, and he writes to an English friend. And let me just quote a couple of sentences from this letter from John Adams. "I know very well that the word disinterested turns the heads of the people by exciting their enthusiasm. But although there are disinterested men, they are not enough in any age or any country to fill all the necessary offices, and therefore the people may depend upon it that the hypocritical pretense of disinterestedness will be set up to deceive them much oftener than the virtue will be practiced for their good." Adams was you might say, a realist or a cynic, but he had reached a limit when he heard all of this talk about disinterested. But it certainly was meaningful to someone like Washington, who took all of these ideals that I've been talking about, of politeness, civilization, very, very seriously. And it affected his behavior. He had, gentlemen in general, had the obligation to serve the public. It was required of them because of their talents, their leisure, their independence, and their social preeminence. Now, as aspiring gentlemen, the leaders of the revolutionary generation shared all of these assumptions, as I say, of work, of leisure, of politeness, and civilization. Indeed, they were primed to receive, peculiarly primed to receive all these new enlightened ideas about civility and gentility. More so, I think, than the English themselves. They were like the Scots, another people living on the periphery of the British Empire. All of these ideals of enlightened ideals had a special appeal, I think, for all the outlying, underdeveloped provinces of the greater British world. Both the Americans and the Scots were provincial peoples living on the edges of the metropolitan world. Both provincial societies lacked the presence of the great hereditary noble families that were at the ruling center of English public life. After the Act of Settlement in 1707, all the great noble families of Scotland moved south to London, where the action was. And it left Scotland more or less in the control of minor gentry, professional people, comparable to what existed in North America. In both countries, in both areas, North America and Scotland, they were dominated by this level of minor gentry. People who were anxious to have their status determined less by their ancestry or the size of their estates and more by their behavior or their learning. So you have a peculiar need among these people in both Scotland and the dominant classes in both Scotland and North America to these new enlightened ideals. Both the Scots and the North Americans, moreover, were acutely aware of the contrast between civilization and the nearby barbarism, in the case of Scotland, of the Highland Scots, and in the case of the North Americans, of the Indians on their frontier, who were considered to be savage and barbaric. Both were keenly aware, too, of the degrees of civilization because of the presence of barbarism, of savagery, keenly aware of the degrees of civilization, and spent much time writing and reading essays on the stages of social development. Often you have commencement addresses entitled From Rudeness to Refinement. They were preoccupied with how do you become civilized, how do you become refined, and always aware of what was not refinement just beyond the border. Both the Scots and the North Americans knew they lived in a cruder and more simple society than the English did, and that England was well along in the fourth and final stage of social development in commercial society, and that English society had much to offer them in ways of politeness and refinement. Yet at the same time, both the Scots and the Americans knew only too well that the polite and sophisticated metropolitan center of the empire was steeped in luxury and corruption. England had sprawling, poverty-ridden cities, over-refined manners, gross inequalities of rank, complex divisions of labor, and widespread manufacturing of luxuries. All symptoms, it was assumed, of over-advanced social development and social decay. England, the North Americans, and the Scots, in many cases, concluded that England itself was on the verge of dissolution. So what I want to spend the rest of this talk talking about is something I might call the sociology of creativity. Why should these two places on the edges of the British Empire have such an outburst of creative energy at the end of the 18th century? I think it has to do with their very provinciality, their very separateness, if you will, from England, but at the same time, their awareness of being English or being British, of being connected with England. They were proud of their simple native provinces, but keenly aware of the metropolitan center of civilization that was London. Both the Americans and the Scots had the unsettling sense of living in two cultures simultaneously. Although this experience may have been disturbing, and it was disturbing for people, are we truly civilized? Isn't civilization London? Is Philadelphia really civilized? Is Virginia civilized? Is Monticello civilized? But at the same time, it's disturbing because there's London. And yet, I think that very duplication of feeling is creative and stimulating. It was a kind of provincial creativity. And I think we can understand this better if you think about novelists of the 20th century, at the beginning of the century with the Midwest and the flourishing of Midwestern writers, Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis. They were living in Chicago or Minneapolis, knowing about those areas, in some sense, that's part of their lives. But they also knew about New York, and they knew about the larger world in London. And that was disturbing to them, but creative. That's why you have this flourishing of Midwestern thinkers. But you can go through each of the categories of writers in the 20th century. Think of the Southerners, Faulkner and Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, and so on. Acutely aware of being Southern, acutely conscious of their Southernness, but also aware that there was New York and a larger metropolitan world, cultural world, civilized world outside. Blacks, same thing. Acutely conscious of being black and a black culture, sharing a black culture, but aware of a larger white culture as well. James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, you can, all of those people. Jews, the same thing. Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Malabud, all acutely conscious of being Jews, being Jewish culture, but aware that there's a non-Jewish culture as well that is disturbing to them, this conjunction of two cultures, and yet out of it comes great creative activity. And of course, the final example I would give are the Irish. Think of it, going back to Jonathan Swift up through James Joyce into the present. Think of all those great Irish writers. Why? What? It's not in the DNA, it's not in their blood. It's the fact they were living in two worlds simultaneously. Being Irish, sensitive to being Irish, aware of being Irish, but also writing in English, aware of the larger English world, London, nearby. That was disturbing, unsettling, but creative. My point is that was true of the Scots and the North Americans. This accounts for the intellectual ferment in the English-speaking world. The Scots, think of them, David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Miller. I think they matched, if they didn't exceed, the creativity of the American founders. Living so close to what they regarded as savagery and barbarism, both peoples, the Scots and the North Americans, felt compelled to think freshly about the meaning of being civilized. And in the process, they put a heightened emphasis on learned and acquired values at the expense of the traditional inherited values of blood and kinship. They enthusiastically adopted the new enlightened 18th century ideals of gentility. They were preoccupied with their honor or their reputation, or in other words, the way they were represented or viewed by others. These revolutionary leaders inevitably became characters, self-fashioned performers in the theater of life. In Washington, no one was more self-conscious about the fact that he was on a stage than George Washington. Now, theirs was not character as we today are apt to understand it, as the inner personality that contains hidden contradictions and flaws. Instead, their idea of character was the outer life, the public persona, trying to show the world that he was living up to the values and duties that the best of the society expected of him or imposed on him. The revolutionary leaders committed themselves to behaving in a certain moral, virtuous, and civilized manner. Indeed, this intense self-conscious seriousness with which they made that commitment was what ultimately separates them from later generations of American leaders and of course, from us. But that commitment also sets them sharply apart from the older world of their fathers and grandfathers. They were men of high ambition, yet of relatively modest origins. And this combination made achieved rather than ascribed values naturally appealing to them. Almost all the revolutionary leaders, even including the second and third tiers down, the third ranks of leadership, were first-generation gentlemen. That is to say, almost all were the first in their families to attend college and to acquire a liberal arts education and to display the new 18th century marks of an enlightened gentleman. Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, was a wealthy Virginia planter and a surveyor who married successfully into the prestigious Randolph family. But he was not a refined and liberally educated gentleman. He did not read Latin. He did not know French. He did not play the violin. And as far as we know, he never once questioned the idea of a religious establishment or the owning of slaves. But his son, Thomas Jefferson, did. He was very different from his father. Indeed, all the revolutionaries knew things that their fathers had not known, and they were eager to prove themselves by what they believed, by what they valued, by their virtue, by their disinterestedness. But there was one prominent revolutionary leader who did not seek to play the role that the others did. Now, on the face of it, Aaron Burr had all the credentials for being a great founder. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a Princeton graduate, and a charming and wealthy aristocrat. He eventually became a senator from New York and vice president of the United States when it really mattered who the vice president was. He was the third. Think of it. Who were his predecessors? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. He had a promising, promising career. But something set his character apart from his colleagues. He inherited his claim to leadership. John Adams said that he had never known in any country the prejudice in favor of birth, parentage, and descent more conspicuous than in the instance of Colonel Burr. Burr was the son of a president of Princeton and the grandson of another Princeton president, none other than the famous theologian Jonathan Edwards. Burr, said Adams, was connected by blood with many respectable families in New England. Unlike the other leaders of the revolutionary generation, unlike Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, and Franklin, Burr was born fully and unquestionably into whatever nobility and gentility 18th century America had. Unlike the other revolutionary leaders, Burr never felt that he had to earn his aristocratic status. Aristocracy was in his veins, in his blood, and he never forgot it. Consequently, he behaved in a very different fashion from the other revolutionary leaders, especially in promoting his own selfish interests at the expense of the public good. And in the end, I think that difference provoked his fellow statesmen from bringing him down. From Hamilton on the right, Jefferson on the left, they eventually combined without consciously combining to bring Burr down. He becomes, I think, Burr becomes the great exception that proves the rule. Yet the very high-mindedness of these mainstream revolutionary leaders, I think, raises some fundamental questions. If it was the intense commitment of this generation of founders to these new enlightened liberal values that separates them from later generations, why, it might be asked, and it has been asked by recent critical historians, why did these so-called enlightened and liberally educated gentlemen not to do more to reform their society? Why did they fail to enhance the status of women, eliminate slavery entirely, treat the Indians in a more humane manner? Now, it's true that the founders did not accomplish all that many of them wanted to do. It turned out that they did not control their society and culture as much as they thought they did. And they were no more able accurately to predict their future than we can predict our future. In the end, many of their enlightened hopes and their kind of elitist leadership were done in by the very democratic and egalitarian forces that they had unleashed with their revolution. No doubt all of the founders assumed instinctively that the Western territories would eventually belong to the American settlers. There's no doubt of that. But many of them were at the same time scrupulously concerned for the fate of the Indians who occupied those territories. Indeed, the statements of Washington's Secretary of War, Henry Knox, in his letters to Washington about these Indians and about the desire Knox had, to preserve their culture and not have it be wiped out as he thought the New England Indians had been wiped out. I think a modern anthropologist would applaud Knox's feelings. But Knox was not in control of the West. And the Western people, these democratic people who were Jefferson's chosen people, were spreading westward in a very disorderly fashion, flush with confidence that God was on their side, and they paid no attention whatsoever to the plans and policies concocted in eastern capitals. They went ahead and rapidly and chaotically scattered westward and stirred up warfare with the native peoples, into which the federal government was inevitably drawn. Democracy and demography did the same for the other hopes and plans of the founders. All of the prominent leaders thought that the liberal principles of the revolution would eventually destroy the institution of slavery. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Henry Lawrence publicly deplored the injustice of slavery, from that moment, declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798, from that moment, the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. Now, of course, such predictions could not have been more wrong. Far from being doomed, slavery in the United States in the 1790s was on the verge of its greatest expansion. Indeed, at the end of the Revolutionary era, there were more slaves in the nation than had existed in 1760. But such self-deception, such mistaken optimism by the leaders was understandable, for they wanted to believe the best, and initially there was evidence that slavery was dying out. As it was mentioned earlier, there was manumission everywhere in the 1780s. And the northern states, where slavery was not inconsequential, were very busy trying to eliminate the institution. By 1804, all the northern states had done so. The founders thought that the same thing might happen in the southern states. Think of this one fact, which I found really extraordinary. The College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in 1791 awarded an honorary degree to Granville Sharp, the leading British abolitionist at the time. Not only were most American leaders eager to abolish slavery, they thought it would happen naturally. Not only were there more anti-slave societies created in the South than in the North, but manumissions, as I mentioned, in the Upper South were growing rapidly in the years following the Revolution. And many thought that ending the international slave trade in 1808 would eventually kill off the institution. The reason the founders so readily took the issue of slavery off the table in the 1790s because of this mistaken faith in the future. They lived with illusions, many illusions, but we do too, of course. As Oliver Ellsworth, the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, declared, as population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. These leaders simply did not count on the remarkable demographic capacity of the slave states themselves, especially Virginia, to produce slaves for the expanding areas of the Deep South and the Southwest. And whatever the revolutionary leaders might have wished for in ending slavery was nullified by the demands of ordinary white planters for more slaves. So if we want to know why we can never again replicate this extraordinary generation of founders, there's a simple answer. The growth of what we today presumably value most about American society and culture, our egalitarian democracy. In the early 19th century, the voices of ordinary people, at least ordinary white people, began to be heard as never before in history, and they soon overwhelmed the high-minded desires and aims of the revolutionary leaders who had brought them into being. The founders had succeeded only too well in promoting democracy and equality among ordinary people. Indeed, they succeeded in preventing any duplication of themselves. Thank you. Very much. Thank you. Yeah, I would be happy to.
We have time for just a couple of questions before we have to go back. Yes.
That was wonderful. One question is you talked about the first generation, the self-made gentleman, and Burr being the proverbial exception. Maybe a word or two on John Quincy Adams and how he fits into. I know he's
He's the next generation.
next generation, but
John Quincy was a kind of replica of himself, and of his father in many ways, and lived into a democratic world that he found totally, in many respects, totally alien to him. He was so committed to Republican principles when he became president that he refused to fire his cabinet and create his own cabinet. Even though Henry Clay said to me, "You're out of your mind, Mr. Adams. You've got to bring your own people." He said, "No, Republican principles say you do not replace people if they're talented." He was a man out of touch, and yet in the last years of his life, when he lost the presidency to Jackson, who was the exact opposite in many respects of John Quincy Adams. Adams was appalled that his dear Harvard gave Jackson an honorary degree. But as you know, Adams went into the House of Representatives, as just a congressman from Quincy, and he devoted himself to the abolitionist cause. It's one of the great moments in American history. This Adams needs a biographer of the same talent as what David McCullough did for his father. We don't have that book yet, but somebody's got to write it sometime, because Quincy Adams is an extraordinary figure, but a tragic figure in many respects.
Other questions? Let me ask you, one of the things you wrote in your Idea of America that struck me, and I've read it over and over again, that democratic republics are the most fragile of all the states, much more fragile than a monarchy, for example, which can keep order because the monarch imposes the order.
Right.
And we have to keep order by governing ourselves, basically. We the people ourselves have to put the brakes on disorder, and I think we see as we struggle today with how in the world do we reinvent this concept of shared sacrifice in a way in which you will have enough disinterestedness among our citizens to each of us give up. Maybe it's a little higher tax rate, maybe it's a little less benefit that we collect, or whatever it is. Can we reinvent this spirit of disinterestedness in our own contemporary society?
Well, I have a lot more confidence in where we are than perhaps many people. You look abroad and you see this Arab Spring, for example. Montesquieu would have diagnosed these situations in the following way. He'd say, look, authoritarian governments have existed from the beginning of time. Why? Because it's difficult to create a democracy. Democracy is hard work. And I am pessimistic about what's going to happen in Egypt, or even in Tunisia, or God forbid, Libya. I just think it's hard work, and we can see that, and we realize when you look at these struggles, think of the Balkans. We thought they were civilized European states, and they fell apart, and there's still troops keeping the Serbs from the Croats and the Bosnians today. So it's hard work to create a democracy. When you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world, you look at ourselves and you say, well, we're not quite that bad. We're not out in the streets. I think we'll muddle through. I think there are problems we have, but I have much more confidence. And especially when you look out and you see these struggling democracies, and I can only wonder whether they're going to succeed. You have to understand that democracy is majority rule, and Peter talked about this distinction. Authoritarian leaders protect minorities. When Mubarak got ousted, the Coptic Christians are scared. And the Alawite Muslims in Syria are fighting for their lives because they realize if a Sunni state takes over, they're going to be hurt. So we understand these problems. We're fortunate we don't have that kind of struggle. I think once you realize that democracy is very difficult and most people are incapable of it, for whatever reasons, historical, ethnic rivalries, we're blessed. And for all of the infighting and the partisanship, I have a lot of confidence that we'll muddle through. We went through a civil war, as pointed out earlier. This is nothing compared to that. So no one has any prescription, but I think leaders will arise, as they did when we get to the brink of debt repudiation. We managed to muddle through that. We'll probably muddle through these years too.
Well, let me ask you one sort of a different question, and I think that the marriage of sociology, if you want to call it, with political science is so important, and that's why what you've said is so important, so that we understand the unique set of social conditions and values that produced the founding generation that led to the way the Constitution was written. While you may be optimistic about us working through some of the policy challenges we have today, would you agree with Thomas Friedman, who when he was here finally threw up his hands and said, it's probably time just to have a new constitutional convention, rewrite our basic document, and have this generation do it. And I sent him a whole box of books, some by you and others that are on our program, saying, read something about the sociology of the times of our founding. Would you go as far as to say you would trust us to rewrite the Constitution with the level of knowledge in the United States today and the values we have?
We could get 55 people in a room and keep the press out? Maybe. You know, Madison always said that this Constitution could never have been written if the press had been involved. Think of it. They were on for 4 months, guards at the doors, not a word was leaked. I mean, that just would be impossible today. The media would be, nobody could change an opinion. See, they could say something one day and then take it back the next day without having somebody put a microphone in front of them and say, well, what did you say, Senator, yesterday, and you're caught. That's the price we pay for freedom of the press and for freedom, but there's no possibility of duplicating their experience in the convention because the media would not stay out.
I think we might have a question or two at the back here. Yeah, is there a questioner? I can't tell. No? Okay, last chance now to have a crack at our guest speaker. Here's one here coming.
I wanted to say thank you again for coming. I actually had a question about something you said earlier. You mentioned the recognition of a lack of an ethnic identity in America.
Wait a minute,
Say a little louder.
You mentioned the lack of an ethnic identity.
Yes, right.
In the latter half of the 18th century, in talking about, whereas states in Europe, they sort of had an ethnic identity that they could kind of center their culture around. Do you think that one of the goals of the Founding Fathers was to create that sort of culture, but not based around ethnicity, but based around a civic mindedness, specifically the Constitution, creating a civic identity as opposed to an ethnic identity?
Well, they weren't as conscious or as deliberate as that, but think of them, they're Englishmen or they're Brits. Most of them are British. This is not like the Algerians breaking away from France in the 1960s. The Algerians are a distinct ethnicity, a distinct people. But this was not true here. And so there was a problem of identity right up through, and the War of 1812, which is the 200th anniversary is upon us, is all about that issue. Impressment becomes a symbol of that. The fact that you can't tell an Englishman from an American. How do you establish yourself if you're Americans, but you're reading almost 90% of the books you're reading are English publications. The plays you're reading are English. The players are English. Everybody's English, and yet you're different. How are you different? That was a major problem for that whole first generation. And the War of 1812 becomes a kind of epiphany, a way of expressing their Americanness. And out of it, I think, people come with a new sense of identity. So they had an ethnic problem of a different sort. They were caught up in the same ethnicity as their parent state. And this is a peculiar kind of colonial rebellion. The colonial rebellions we're familiar with are distinct peoples breaking away from the metropolitan. I mean, the Indians breaking away from Great Britain, or the Algerians from France. The Americans had a different problem. So they had to think in terms of these founding values, of ideals and aspirations as a thing that held them together. And I think that still holds.
Thank you very much. We've just heard from one of the most remarkable historians in our country, and we thank you very, very much for being with us. Oh, I agree with everything you said.